A world marked by war. Night falls over the Levant. The moon lights ruined towers, broken walls, and the long scars of old sieges. Here, every stone has a story of blood. Persians, Romans, Arabs, Byzantines, all marched across these sands and left their ghosts behind. Then, in the winter of 1095, something new stirred in the west. At Clermont, a single voice rose above the frost-covered crowd. "Go, take back the tomb of Christ." No one could have guessed what would follow. Tens of thousands, knights in mail, barefoot peasants, lords and their ladies, left everything. They crossed mountains, deserts, and rivers of corpses. 3 years later, on a July morning in 1099, Jerusalem fell. The streets ran red for days. A miracle, they called it. But miracles are fragile. The new Christian kingdoms, Jerusalem, Antioch, Edessa, Tripoli, were tiny islands in a Muslim ocean. Most crusaders took the first ship home. Those who stayed were outnumbered 100 to 1. The roads to the holy places became killing grounds. In a single Easter season, 700 pilgrims left the coast. Only 400 reached the city. This was the world that waited for 9 men who carried nothing but a dangerous idea. Section 1. The 9 who walked into the East. The origins of the Knights Templar can be traced to the year 1119, 2 decades after the First Crusade. In these years, the situation in the Holy Land remained unstable. The road from Jaffa to Jerusalem is a gauntlet of thieves and assassins. Even the walls of the Holy City itself offer no real safety once you step outside them. Although the Crusaders had secured major coastal cities and established functioning states, the Latin population was small and scattered. The number of professional fighting men available to defend the region was insufficient. Bands of raiders targeted Christian pilgrims moving between Jaffa and Jerusalem, and local lords struggled to maintain secure borders. It was within this environment that Hugues de Payens and a small group of like-minded knights arrived in Jerusalem. There were only 9 of them. 9. Not an army. Not even a company. Just 9 men who have left everything behind. Titles, lands, families, to do something no one has ever done before. Far too few to influence politics or major battles, yet they offered something that the kingdom desperately needed. We will fight for no lord, no gold, no glory. Only for the pilgrims who walk these roads. Baldwin stares at them in silence, then smiles. He has fewer than 2,000 fighting men in the entire kingdom. He cannot refuse free swords that ask for nothing in return. A permanent force, dedicated to protecting travelers and maintaining security along the roadways. King Baldwin II, recognizing the practical value of this volunteer group, granted them a place to live. Not an ordinary residence, but a structure attached to the former Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. To the Crusaders, this site was associated with Solomon's Temple, giving the group its distinctive identity and name. At this early stage, the group possessed no formal rule, no substantial resources, and no fixed hierarchy. They lived simply and relied on donations from local clergy and settlers. For nearly 10 years, they operated in relative obscurity, providing escort services and participating in occasional defensive actions. Yet, from these modest beginnings, the institution would develop into a vast organization. Over the course of the 13th century, the order expanded on a scale unmatched by any other religious or military group of the era. At its height, it may have included around 7,000 members, supported by an extensive network of approximately 870 castles, commanderies, and administrative houses across Western Christendom. By 1318, pensions for former members were being issued in dioceses throughout France, England, Ireland, the Low Countries, the German states, Italy, Cyprus, Aragon, and Mallorca. This infrastructure sustained fighting forces deployed not only in Palestine and Syria, but also in Cyprus, Iberia, and the islands of the Mediterranean. By the late 12th and early 13th centuries, The order maintained around 600 knights and roughly 2,000 sergeants in active service in the east. It also operated a Mediterranean fleet capable of transporting men, supplies, and correspondence to and from the Levant. Despite this later scale, the order's origins were far more humble. Its early mission took shape within the unstable political landscape created after the First Crusade. Although the Latin states had achieved notable successes, capturing most of the major coastal cities and establishing functioning governments, they remained militarily vulnerable. The local Frankish population was small, and many crusaders departed once Jerusalem had been taken. Defense thus required new solutions, and the emergence of a disciplined, permanent, and religiously motivated military group offered exactly that. The Naina men who settled on the Temple Mount in 1119 could not have foreseen the scale of what their initiative would become. But their presence marked the beginning of an institution that, over the next 2 centuries, would influence not only warfare in the East, but also politics, finance, and international relations across medieval Europe. Section 2. The Founding of the Order, a Fractured Holy Land. The early 12th century was a time of deep instability in the Holy Land. The First Crusade had taken Jerusalem in 1099, but winning the city had not meant stabilizing it. The newly created Latin states, Jerusalem, Tripoli, Edessa, and Antioch, were weakened, short on manpower, and surrounded by hostile forces. Bands of raiders moved freely across the countryside. Pilgrims traveling even within sight of Jerusalem's walls were attacked, robbed, or killed. This is the world into which the First Templars stepped. The earliest beginnings, 1119. According to most accounts, the origins of the order trace back to around 1119, when a small band of knights led by Hugues de Payens arrived in Jerusalem and offered their military services to the fragile Christian kingdom. Who was Hugues de Payens? Contemporary and later sources disagree on his exact origins. The Latin text of William of Tyre refers to him simply as Hugo de Paganis, without specifying a birthplace. A later French translation claims he came from somewhere near Troy. Walter Map, a 12th century writer, states he was from Pains, a village near Troy in the region of Champagne. Italian sources sometimes identify him as Ugo de Pagani, from Nocera de Pagani in Campania. A surviving letter from 1103 mentions Hugues writing from Palestine to my father in Nocera, lending some support to the Italian theory. Charters connected to Hugh of Champagne also reference a Hugo Dominus de Payens, suggesting Hugues served in the count's entourage. By 1113, he was married to Elizabeth de Chappes and fathered at least one child, Thibaut. Most historians agree he died in Palestine, likely in 1136, and the order commemorates him on May 24th each year. Regardless of the exact origin, what matters is this: Hugues de Payens was a respected knight with connections to French nobility, and he possessed enough authority to recruit companions for a radical idea. The first 9 knights. According to tradition, Hugues approached King Baldwin II with 8 companions: Godfrey de Saint-Omer, Payen de Montdidier, Archambault de Saint-Agnan, André de Montbard, Geoffrey Bizon, Rosal, Gondomar, and one unnamed knight. These men were bound by blood, marriage, or feudal loyalty. Their proposal was simple, unprecedented, and powerful. They would live as a religious community and vow themselves to the protection of pilgrims traveling through the Holy Land. The king accepted, recognizing that he lacked enough cavalry to secure the kingdom's roads. What he offered them in return was extraordinary. Their base, the Temple Mount. Baldwin II granted the knights residence in a structure the Crusaders believed stood on the site of Solomon's Temple, the former Al-Aqsa Mosque. This location carried enormous symbolic weight. The association quickly shaped their identity. From it came their formal Latin name, Pauperes Commilitones Christi Templici Salomonici, the poor fellow soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. In time, The world would know them simply as the Knights Templar. The early years: poverty, danger, and a growing reputation. For nearly a decade, the Templars remained a tiny and unofficial group. They had no papal recognition, no formal rule, no financial support, no structured hierarchy, and no guaranteed supply of recruits. They lived on donations of food and clothing from clergy and Christian settlers. They owned almost nothing. Yet their impact was immediate. They patrolled the perilous roads between Jaffa and Jerusalem, a route so dangerous that chroniclers compared it to a death trap. Pilgrims who survived the journey carried stories home about the knights who guarded the roads. The clergy praised their discipline and modest lifestyle. Slowly, the name of Hugh de Paillon spread across Europe. The idea of monks who fought, men bound by vows yet trained for war, was something completely new. It challenged long-held assumptions about the incompatibility of monastic life and military activity. A militarized religious order had never existed before, and the Church took notice. A Journey to Europe, 1127 to 1128. In 1127, everything changes. Baldwin II sends Hugh de Paillon back to Europe with royal letters sealed in wax. The message is desperate and direct. Help these men. They are all that stands between the Holy Land and collapse. Hugh storms across France, England, Flanders, Scotland. Nobles press estates into his hands. In England, he secured donations and founded what would become the first Templar houses in London. In Scotland, he established the priory at Ballintrodoch, near modern-day Edinburgh. These visits drew great attention from aristocrats and clergy alike. The concept of an order of warrior monks fascinated the courts of Europe, and one influential figure would become their greatest advocate. The Council of Troyes, 1129. Then, in the cold January of 1129, the Council of Troyes assembles. Bishops, abbots, papal legates, and one man whose voice carries more weight than all the rest, Bernard, abbot of Clairvaux, the most powerful churchman in Europe and uncle to one of the original 9. Bernard listens to Hugh speak. He asks questions. He deliberates. And then he gives the Templars the greatest gift any new order could receive: his complete, fiery, unreserved support, one of the most powerful religious figures of the age. Bernard reviewed the mission of the Templars and judged their cause worthy of official approval. At Troyes, the Templars were granted an official monastic rule, full ecclesiastical recognition, and the authority to expand across Christendom. A group of 9 poor knights who once lived beneath the Temple Mount had now become a sanctioned religious military institution. Donations of land, money, and manpower soon poured in. By the early 1130s, the Templars were rising rapidly. They were no longer merely guardians of the pilgrim roads. They were becoming the first international military organization in Western history. Their role in the Holy Land and across Europe was about to expand dramatically. From escorting pilgrims, they would evolve into elite shock troops, fortress commanders, bankers, diplomats, landowners, and ultimately, major political players who rivaled the authority of kings. Section 3. The Council of Troyes and the Latin Rule. By the late 1120s, the small band of knights who had once lived in poverty beneath the Temple Mount was ready to be shaped into an institution. What they lacked, structure, legitimacy, and a formal code, would soon be provided by the highest levels of the Latin Church. The decisive moment came with the convening of the Council of Troyes in January 1129. This ecclesiastical assembly brought together prominent churchmen from across France, including bishops, abbots, and legates representing the Pope. Among them was one figure whose influence would prove pivotal: Bernard of Clairvaux, abbot of Clairvaux, and one of the most respected spiritual leaders of the age. The Templars appealed to Bernard because they represented a new way of reconciling warfare with Christian devotion, an idea he was uniquely positioned to defend. The Templars. Bernard believed deeply in the moral duty of Christians to protect the Holy Land, and he viewed the Templars as instruments of divine purpose. At the council, Hugh de Payen presented the case for the order. He described its origins, its mission of safeguarding pilgrims, and its commitment to a disciplined monastic form of life. The assembled clergy questioned him about the group's practices and intentions, seeking reassurance that a life of arms could coexist with the strict moral demands of religious vows. The council approved the creation of a new monastic rule, the Latin Rule, a written code that would define the daily life, moral conduct, hierarchy, and obligations of every Templar. The rule borrowed from the rule of St. Augustine, but was mostly inspired by the rule of St. Benedict. It was, however, adapted for use by active, primarily military knights rather than cloistered monks. For example, the fasts were less severe so that they did not interfere with combat. The original rule was written in 1128 and added to the minutes of the Council of Troyes in 1129. However, in about 1138, under the direction of Robert de Craon, second Grand Master of the Order, 1136 to 1149, the rule was translated into French and modified. Later, it was expanded to include 609 articles, notably covering such things as hierarchy and justice within the order. The rule drew heavily from the Cistercian model, simple, austere, and emphasizing humility. It contained 72 articles in its earliest form, prescribing in detail the organization of meals, clothing, sleep, prayer, and discipline. Templars were forbidden to indulge in luxury or personal wealth. Their garments were plain, their equipment utilitarian. Their possessions, even their horses and armor, were the property of the order. What set the Latin Rule apart from any earlier monastic code was that it included explicit military elements. Templars were expected to fight, to defend Christian territory, and to do so under strict obedience. Their courage was linked not to glory or plunder, but to spiritual duty. The rule prohibited retreat unless overwhelmingly outnumbered. It banned ransom payments for captured brothers, emphasizing instead the expectation of steadfastness in battle. It established uniform discipline, creating a cohesion unmatched by contemporary feudal armies. This formalization came during a period when the Crusader states faced constant threats, and the need for an organized, dependable fighting force was growing rapidly. The recognition of the Templars represented the Church's acknowledgement that conventional feudal levies were insufficient for the permanent defense of the Holy Land. The Council's endorsement transformed the Templars in three fundamental ways. 1. Legitimacy. They were now a formally recognized religious order under papal authority. This status placed them above local bishops, allowing them to operate independently across Christendom. 2. Structure. The Latin Rule provided a governance model that allowed the order to scale rapidly, both militarily and administratively. 3rd appeal. Nobles and knights across Europe now had a sanctioned path to combine their military calling with spiritual devotion. Donations of land, money, and manpower surged almost immediately. When Hugh de Payen returned to the Holy Land after the council, he did so not as the leader of a small, informal brotherhood, but as the head of a new international institution, one with legal authority, ecclesiastical backing, and a growing financial base. Within a few years, Templar commanderies had been established across France, England, Portugal, and the Iberian kingdoms. These houses provided recruits, supplies, and revenue for the conflict in the East. They also became administrative centers, laying the foundation for what would soon be the most advanced logistical network in medieval Europe. By the early 1130s, the order was evolving from a small contingent of knight monks into a permanent military force embedded within the crusading world. The Templars were no longer simply guardians of pilgrim roads. They were becoming a central pillar of the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem, a force whose discipline and reliability set them apart from all other military groups in the region. In the decades that followed, their presence would expand far beyond escort duty into castle garrisons, expedition armies, diplomatic missions, and administrative offices. The transformation was complete. The order had been born. And now the long ascent to power could begin. Now let's quote the Latin rules. Let's quote a part of the prologue. We speak firstly to all those who secretly despise their own will and desire with a pure heart to serve the sovereign king as a knight, and with studious care desire to wear and wear permanently the very noble armor of obedience. And therefore we admonish you, you who until now have led the lives of secular knights, in which Jesus Christ was not the cause, but which you embraced for human favor only, to follow those whom God has chosen from the mass of perdition, and whom he has ordered through his gracious mercy to defend the Holy Church, and that you hasten to join them forever. Above all things, whosoever would be a knight of Christ, choosing such holy orders, you in your profession of faith must unite pure diligence and firm perseverance, which is so worthy and so holy, and is known to be so noble, that if it is preserved untainted forever, you will deserve to keep company with the martyrs who gave their souls for Jesus Christ. In this religious order has flourished and is revitalized the order of knighthood. This knighthood despised the love of justice that constitutes its duties, and did not do what it should, that is, defend the poor, widows, orphans, and churches, but strove to plunder, despoil, and kill. God works well with us and our Savior Jesus Christ. He has sent his friends from the holy city of Jerusalem to the marches of France and Burgundy, who for our salvation and the spread of the true faith do not cease to offer their souls to God, a welcome sacrifice. Then we, in all joy and all brotherhood, at the request of Master Hugues de Payens, by whom the aforementioned knighthood was founded by the grace of the Holy Spirit, assembled at Troyes from divers provinces beyond the mountains on the feast of my Lord St. Hilary, in the year of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, 1128, in the 9th year after the founding of the aforesaid knighthood, and the conduct and beginnings of the order of knighthood, we heard in common chapter from the lips of the aforementioned master, Brother Hugues de Payens. And according to the limitations of our understanding, what seemed to us good and beneficial we praised, and what seemed wrong we eschewed. And all that took place at that council cannot be told nor recounted, and so that it should not be taken lightly by us, but considered in wise prudence, we left it to the discretion of both our honorable father Lord Honorius, and of the noble patriarch of Jerusalem, Stephen, who knew the affairs of the East and of the poor knights of Christ. By the advice of the common council, we praised it unanimously. Although a great number of religious fathers who assembled at that council praised the authority of our words, nevertheless we should not pass over in silence the true sentences and judgments which they pronounced. Therefore I, Jean-Michel, to whom was entrusted and confided that divine office, by the grace of God served as the humble scribe of the present document by order of the council and of the venerable Father Bernard, Abbot of Clairvaux. And now let's give an example of 5 rules, the manner in which brothers should be received. If any secular knight or any other man wishes to leave the mass of perdition and abandon that secular life and choose your communal life, do not consent to receive him immediately. For thus said my Lord St. Paul, probate spiritus si ex Deo sunt, that is to say, test the soul to see if it comes from God. Rather, if the company of the brothers is to be granted to him, let the rule be read to him, and if he wishes to studiously obey the commandments of the rule, and if it pleases the master and the brothers to receive him, let him reveal his wish and desire before all the brothers assembled in chapter, and let him make his request with a pure heart. On excommunicated knights. Where you know excommunicated knights to be gathered, there we command you to go. And if anyone there wishes to join the order of knighthood from regions overseas, you should not consider worldly gain so much as the eternal salvation of his soul. We order him to be received on condition that he come before the bishop of that province and make his intention known to him. And when the bishop has heard and absolved him, he should send him to the master and brothers of the temple. And if his life is honest and worthy of their company, if he seems good to the master and brothers, let him be mercifully received. And if he should die in the meanwhile, through the anguish and torment he has suffered, let him be given all the benefits of the brotherhood due to one of the poor knights of the temple. Under no other circumstances should the brothers of the temple share the company of an obviously excommunicated man, nor take his own things. And this we prohibit strongly, because it would be a fearful thing if they were excommunicated like him. But if he is only forbidden to hear the divine office, it is certainly possible to keep company with him and take his property for charity with the permission of their commander. On not receiving children. Although the rule of the Holy Fathers allows the receiving of children into a religious life, we do not advise you to do this. For he who wishes to give his child eternally to the order of knighthood should bring him up until such time as he is able to bear arms with vigor and rid the land of the enemies of Jesus Christ. Then let the mother and father lead him to the house and make his request known to the brothers, and it is much better if he does not take the vow when he is a child, but when he is older, and it is better if he does not regret it than if he regrets it. And henceforth let him be put to the test according to the wisdom of the master and brothers, and according to the honesty of the life of the one who asks to be admitted to the brotherhood. On shirts. Among the other things, we mercifully rule that, because of the great intensity of the heat which exists in the East, from Easter to All Saints, through compassion and in no way as a right, a linen shirt shall be given to any brother who wishes to wear it. How they may have lands and men. This kind of new order, we believe, was born out of the Holy Scriptures and divine providence in the Holy Land of the Fast. That is to say that this armed company of knights may kill the enemies of the cross without sinning. For this reason we judge you to be rightly called Knights of the Temple, with the double merit and beauty of probity, and that you may have lands and keep men, villains and fields, and govern them justly, and take your right to them as it is specifically established. Section 4. Early expansion in the Crusader states. By the early 1130s, the order had secured its position within the Christian world. With a formal rule, papal approval, and growing support from European nobility, it began the process of transforming itself from a small brotherhood into a structured, durable institution capable of influencing events across continents. The foundation of this growth lay in the strategic realities of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Latin principalities founded after the First Crusade were numerically weak and constantly exposed to attacks from neighboring Muslim powers. Local Frankish lords controlled narrow strips of territory, often isolated from one another by rugged terrain and shifting alliances. Every frontier settlement, every pilgrimage road, and every coastal fortress required defense, yet the manpower available to the Christian rulers was always insufficient. Into this landscape, the order introduced something new. A permanent military presence not tied to seasonal service or feudal obligation. Its members were bound by vows and lived communally, ensuring that their dedication to the defense of the Holy Land did not depend on personal wealth or political convenience. During this period, the order began to receive significant donations of land, rights, and revenues. These gifts were not limited to Europe. Lords in the Eastern territories also granted strategic estates, enabling the knights to maintain a continuous logistical chain between their houses in the West and their operations in the East. As their numbers increased, the order established a network of commanderies, administrative centers that served multiple purposes. They housed new recruits preparing for service in the Holy Land. They stored grain, weapons, horses, and other supplies needed for long campaigns. They collected revenues from surrounding lands and transferred them to the East. They functioned as local points of authority in legal, agricultural, and financial matters. This administrative expansion strengthened their military capability. The order became responsible for manning a number of key fortifications in the Crusader states. These were typically isolated outposts guarding vital routes, positions that required disciplined soldiers willing to endure long stretches of monotony punctuated by sudden attacks. Among the most notable were the castles controlling the approaches to Jerusalem and the frontier zones near the regions of Galilee and Transjordan. The knights became experts in siege defense, rapid mounted response, and the maintenance of extended supply lines. In comparison with the often fragmented forces commanded by local princes, the order offered continuity and professional discipline. European rulers, observing the increasing effectiveness of the order, began to view it as a natural recipient for donations of property. Such gifts not only served pious purposes, but also provided a practical means to support the defense of the Holy Land from afar. The order's extensive reach made it possible to channel resources quickly to the front lines, bypassing the logistical obstacles that frequently hindered Crusader armies. During this time, the leadership structure of the order also became more defined. The master, elected from among the professed knights, served as the head of the institution. Below him, a hierarchy of officials administered everything from discipline and recruitment to financial management and military operations. This system allowed the order to react efficiently to changes on the ground and to coordinate activities across thousands of kilometers. The combination of religious dedication, a codified way of life, administrative sophistication, and martial discipline made the order increasingly central to the survival of the Crusader states. While the military contingents of local lords varied in quality and reliability, the order provided a consistent force that could be relied upon in times of crisis. By the middle of the 12th century, the knights were no longer a marginal group of volunteers living on the Temple Mount. They had become one of the central pillars of Latin power in the East, a structured, wealthy, and strategically vital organization with roles that extended far beyond escorting pilgrims. Their rise had only begun. In the decades to come, they would play key roles in major battles, negotiate with rulers on both sides of the conflict, and control some of the most formidable fortresses in the eastern Mediterranean. But with military prominence came new pressures. The balance of power in the region was shifting, and challenges far greater than raiders on pilgrimage roads were approaching. Section 5. The military role of the order. By the mid-12th century, the order had become a permanent feature of warfare in the eastern Mediterranean. Its presence on the battlefield was no longer a novelty, but an expectation. Whenever the rulers of Jerusalem assembled an army, whether for major campaigns or for regional patrols, the white mantles bearing the red cross appeared among the front ranks. Because it was one of the most disciplined units of its age, the knights were required to live austere lives. They could have meat only 3 times a week, except on special holidays, since eating flesh was understood to corrupt the body. Fur and fancy clothes were forbidden. So were pointed shoes and shoelaces, since these abominable things belonged to pagans. Of course, chastity was a must, and Templars were forbidden to kiss any woman, even their own mother. Breaking the rules could mean getting a beating, being banished from the brotherhood, or having to eat meals on the floor. The military organization of the order was structured with the same precision as its spiritual discipline. Its forces were divided into distinct categories. The corps consisted of fully professed knights, experienced mounted warriors who had taken the full vows of the order. Their armor, equipment, and horses were supplied entirely by the institution. The Knight brothers came from the military aristocracy and were trained in the arts of war. They assumed elite leadership positions in the order and served at royal and papal courts. Only the knights wore the Templars' distinctive regalia, a white surcoat marked with a red cross. And supporting them were the sergeants' serving brothers, who were usually from lower social classes, made up the majority of members. They dressed in black habits and served as both warriors and servants, lightly armored mounted men or infantry who played vital roles in battle formations, reconnaissance, and logistical support. The order also employed Turco-Poles, locally recruited horsemen accustomed to the fast-moving tactics of the region. This combination allowed the order to field forces capable of responding to a wide range of threats, from large armies to small raiding parties. The Templars developed a reputation for discipline under fire. They acted as the advance force in a number of battles of the Crusades, including the Battle of Montgisard, when they helped greatly outnumbered Christian forces defeat an army led by the great Muslim commander Saladin. A part of that fierceness probably came from religious devotion, which allowed them to see breaking their vows as a fate worse than death. The rule of the Knights Templar called for them to never retreat, surrender, or charge without being ordered to do so. Excellent features for any army that needs to remain disciplined. Their willingness to hold positions even under overwhelming pressure distinguished them from many contemporaries. This reliability made them ideal defenders of frontier castles, where garrisons had to endure isolation, shortages, and the constant risk of surprise attacks. One essential aspect of the Templars' military activities was their integration into the broader defensive system of the Latin states. Castles and cities were often separated by considerable distances, and rapid communication was vital. Mounted patrols, coordinated through the Order's chain of command, provided early warning of enemy movements, reducing the likelihood of sudden attacks catching settlements unprepared. The Order's approach to warfare emphasized collective action rather than personal valor. Templar Knights were prohibited from charging ahead of their commanders or breaking formation, even if they believed an opportunity for victory was at hand. This contrasted sharply with the tendencies of many feudal knights who were accustomed to seeking individual distinction on the battlefield. As the Order's numbers increased, it began taking responsibility for significant strongholds within the Crusader states. Many of these fortresses protected vital roadways, mountain passes, or river crossings. Their design reflected the evolving nature of siege warfare, with improvements in walls, towers, and defensive layouts made possible by the Order's resources and long-term presence. By the 1140s, the Templars were also becoming more deeply involved in diplomatic and strategic matters. Their leaders communicated regularly with secular rulers, regional commanders, and other religious orders. Their deployment decisions were made not simply on the basis of immediate threats, but with consideration of the broader political landscape. The Order's military responsibilities continued to expand as conflicts intensified. From defending outlying settlements to participating in major expeditions, the Templars were increasingly expected to provide the backbone of Crusader armies. Their reputation, built on consistency and discipline, positioned them as the primary guardians of the Christian states. Yet this dependence had unintended consequences. As the Order became essential to the survival of the Eastern principalities, political leaders grew more reliant on its resources. This reliance, while practical in the short term, would eventually create friction regarding authority, strategy, and the proper use of military force. Still, during this period, cooperation remained the norm. The Order served as an anchor in a region marked by shifting alliances and unpredictable threats. Its commanders offered continuity as secular rulers came and went, and as the balance of power between Christian and Muslim forces changed from year to year. The military identity of the Order was now firmly established. Its role in the defense of the Holy Land was unquestioned. But the growing strength of regional powers and the emergence of new leadership among Muslim polities were about to transform the strategic environment. Ahead lay campaigns on a scale far larger than anything the Order had yet faced. Section 6, Strategic Pressures and the Rise of New Powers. By the middle of the 12th century, the political and military situation in the Eastern Mediterranean became increasingly complex. The Latin principalities, Jerusalem, Antioch, Tripoli, and Edessa, had never enjoyed numerical superiority, but in earlier decades, the fragmentation of their opponents had mitigated this disadvantage. Now, however, new leaders and emerging powers began to alter the balance. The Muslim world, although diverse and divided, produced commanders and dynasties who were politically skilled and militarily effective. Their consolidation posed a direct challenge to the survival of the Crusader states. For the Order, this meant that its responsibilities grew not gradually, but sharply and in response to mounting pressure. In the north, the vulnerability of Edessa became a focal point. Surrounded by hostile territories and distant from major coastal supply lines, the county had long depended on fragile alliances. Its fall in 1144 sent shockwaves through the region. The capture of the city demonstrated that the Latin states were no longer facing isolated threats, but coordinated actions by stronger regional forces. The consequences were immediate. The loss of Edessa weakened the entire frontier, reduced the strategic depth of the Christian positions, and increased the burden on the remaining states. Defensive lines were compressed, making every fortress and every garrison more critical. The order was expected to reinforce outposts, escort assemblies of troops, and compensate for the shortage of trained cavalry that persisted throughout the Crusader territories. The response from Western Europe came in the form of a new crusade. Although intended to reverse the recent losses, the campaign encountered logistical difficulties, unfamiliar terrain, and internal disagreements. The armies assembled in the west were large, but their commanders lacked experience in the conditions of the Levant. In this environment, professional forces already stationed in the east, such as the Knights of the Order, played a stabilizing role, offering guidance and support to the arriving contingents. Nevertheless, the challenges facing the Latin states were not restricted to military threats. Political tensions within the region complicated decision-making. Local rulers often held conflicting priorities, influenced by dynastic considerations or personal rivalries. Coordination between the states was inconsistent, and at times, individual leaders acted independently of broader strategic interests. Within this shifting landscape, the order maintained a consistent presence. Its commanders focused on improving fortifications along vulnerable borders, reinforcing critical positions, and preserving the infrastructure that connected the settlements of the Latin East. The order's discipline offered a measure of reliability in a system where secular forces could fluctuate from year to year. As the decade progressed, the need for fortified centers became ever clearer. Castles served not only as defensive posts, but also as administrative hubs, supply depots, and secure places of refuge for surrounding populations. The order's involvement in constructing, maintaining, and defending these fortifications tied it deeply to the stability of the region. The pressures of this period marked the beginning of a long struggle. The emergence of capable Muslim leaders, the demographic limitations of the Crusader states, and the logistical challenges of maintaining connections with Europe indicated that the coming decades would test the endurance of the entire Latin presence in the East. For the order, these years represented a turning point. No longer functioning merely as guardians of pilgrimage routes, the knights had become integral to regional defense. Their responsibilities continued to expand, not as a matter of choice, but as a necessity imposed by the evolving strategic realities. Ahead lay conflicts of greater scale, battles that would define the fortunes of the Crusader states, and challenges that would push the order to the limits of its capacity. Section 7. A region under pressure. In the decades that followed the fall of Edessa in 1144, the political balance of the eastern Mediterranean began to shift in ways the Crusader states could no longer control. What had once been a precarious but manageable frontier slowly evolved into a landscape defined by rising threats, internal fractures, and opponents who were learning to fight with greater unity. By the 1160s, the Latin states, Jerusalem, Tripoli, Antioch, and the remnants of Edessa, found themselves entering one of the most critical and dangerous periods of their existence. After the First Crusade, these principalities had formed a thin line of Christian rule across the Levant. Their survival depended on reinforcements from Europe, on maritime supply lines extending across the Mediterranean, and on a chain of frontier fortresses that held back constant pressure from surrounding Muslim powers. Yet beneath this outward framework, the states were fragile. Their populations were small, their nobility frequently divided, and their kings often confronted contested successions that disrupted stability at decisive moments. During the 1160s, these weaknesses became increasingly impossible to ignore. In Jerusalem, the death of Baldwin III in 1162 placed the crown in the hands of his younger brother, Amalric I. Though intelligent and ambitious, Amalric devoted much of his attention to projecting power into Egypt, an aim that drew the kingdom into a long, exhausting cycle of campaigns. His focus on the distant south left Jerusalem's northern frontier dangerously exposed. To the north, Antioch faced its own turmoil. Prince Bohemond III struggled to maintain internal authority while contending with external enemies eager to exploit the principality's vulnerability. Antioch's strategic position made it a natural target, and political rivalries within its borders weakened its ability to respond to these threats. Meanwhile, Tripoli was plunged into instability following the assassination of Count Raymond II in 1152, which triggered disputes among noble families and further fractured the region's political coherence. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, no institution proved more stable and essential than the Knights. Their discipline, permanence, and military reliability became a cornerstone of regional defense at a time when feudal lords could offer only short-term service. The Knights provided the continuity the Latin states desperately needed, and their role was about to become even more critical. Across the frontier, a profound transformation was taking place. Nur ad-Din, son of Imad ad-Din Zengi, consolidated his authority in Aleppo and later extended his influence over Damascus, effectively unifying northern and southern Syria under a single coordinated leadership. He was not merely a military commander, he was a statesman and strategist who reformed taxation, strengthened fortresses, reorganized armies, and promoted religious unity. For the Latin states, this new coherence among their adversaries represented a severe threat. Beginning in the early 1160s, Nur ad-Din intensified pressure along the northern frontier. Raids struck Antiochian territory more frequently. Frontier fortresses came under growing threat. Trade routes were disrupted, slowing the movement of goods and weakening the fragile economic networks of the Crusader states. Isolated garrisons were tested relentlessly for weaknesses. The Knights were forced to conduct continuous patrols stretching from Bagras to Saft, responding to a level of coordinated raiding that signaled not yet an invasion, but unmistakably a strategic preparation. Nur ad-Din understood that the Latin states could be defeated not only by battlefield victories, but by straining their resources, exploiting their internal divisions, and slowly wearing them down. And in Jerusalem, those divisions were becoming more pronounced. It was at this tense moment that Egypt became the center of an escalating struggle. Ruled by the weakening Fatimid Caliphate, Egypt was wealthy, populous, and strategically indispensable. Whoever controlled Egypt would shape the southern flank of the Crusader states and command enormous economic resources. Amalric I believed that seizing Egypt before Nur ad-Din could intervene was the only way to secure the kingdom's long-term survival. The Knights, however, urged caution. They recognized that Jerusalem's manpower was already depleted and that prolonged campaigns risked disaster. Despite their warnings, Amalric pressed forward. Between 1163 and 1169, Amalric launched multiple invasions into Egypt. The Templars accompanied him as elite cavalry, serving as shock troops during sieges and defending supply lines along the Sinai route. They participated in delicate negotiations with Egyptian viziers, finding themselves drawn into a complex triangle of shifting allegiances. Shawar, the unstable Egyptian vizier, Shirkuh, the formidable general serving Nur ad-Din, and Amalric himself. Shawar played both sides, inviting Amalric for support one year and Shirkuh the next. The order became tangled in this web of intrigue, which consumed resources and created instability across the entire region. These campaigns drained Jerusalem's finances and manpower, achieving little lasting result. Yet they produced one monumental consequence: the emergence of Shirkuh's nephew, a young commander named Saladin, who entered Egypt during these decisive years. His rise would soon transform the region. During this decade, the responsibilities placed upon the knights expanded dramatically. They garrisoned the kingdom's most important frontier fortresses, Gaza, Saft, La Fève, Bagras, and Chastel Blanc. They patrolled thousands of kilometers of roads, defended the approaches to Jerusalem, facilitated negotiations and prisoner exchanges, and maintained communication lines between northern and southern states. They were the only permanent military force capable of long-term service, and administrative records reveal that they supplied everything from grain shipments to war horses, blacksmiths, masons, armorsmiths, and long-range reconnaissance scouts. While feudal troops rotated in and out, the knights remained indefinitely, forming the backbone of the region's defense. But by the late 1160s, the situation had become untenable. Jerusalem faced financial strain. Antioch's frontier was collapsing. Tripoli remained politically fractured. Egypt had fallen under the growing influence of Nur ad-Din. The knights were stretched across too many fronts. Europe showed little interest in committing to a new crusade. Signs of crisis surfaced everywhere. Fortresses reported shortages, peasants abandoned frontier lands, patrols encountered increasingly organized raiding bands. Muslim forces coordinated operations across Syria, Mesopotamia, and soon Egypt. The Latin states had long relied on the hope that their adversaries would remain divided. That hope had perished. As the region moved into the 1170s, the stage was set for a new power to rise, one capable of uniting Syria and Egypt into a single force that would reshape the destiny of the Latin East. That power would be Saladin. Section 8. The Rise of Saladin and the Strategic Collapse of the Latin East. The early 1170s marked one of the most decisive transformations in the history of the Crusader states. For decades, the Latin presence in the East had survived only because the Muslim world remained divided, Syria, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, competing for influence rather than uniting under a single authority. This disunity had been the silent protector of the Crusader principalities. But between 1169 and 1174, that fragile balance collapsed entirely. A new political reality emerged, one shaped by the rise of a single figure whose diplomatic skill, administrative vision, and military discipline would fuse Syria and Egypt into a formidable empire. That figure was Salah ad-Din Yusuf ibn Ayyub, known in the West as Saladin. Before his ascent, Egypt had been ruled by the Fatimid Caliphate, a Shia regime weakened by decades of internal conflict, assassinations, unstable viziers, and spiraling economic mismanagement. Its immense wealth made it an irresistible target for every major power in the region. Jerusalem saw in Egypt both a potential source of resources and a critical southern frontier that could secure their long-term survival. Nur ad-Din saw the possibility of ideological unity and geopolitical dominance. Even local Egyptian factions sought to manipulate both sides simply to survive. Between 1163 and 1169, Egypt became a battleground where diplomacy, betrayal, and military ambition collided. Vizier Shawar invited Crusader forces one year, only to betray them the next. Nur ad-Din dispatched his general Shirkuh to impose a pro-Syrian government, while King Amalric I repeatedly launched invasions hoping to bring Egypt under Jerusalem's control. The knights were involved at every stage, escorting Amalric's army across Sinai, providing shock cavalry in Giza and Bilbais, defending coastal supply routes, and negotiating with Egyptian officials when truces were declared. But each operation drained the already limited resources of the Latin states, while Nur ad-Din adopted a strategy of disciplined patience. He understood that Egypt would eventually fall into his orbit. All he needed to do was wait for the Crusaders to exhaust themselves. In early 1169, Shirkuh launched a final decisive campaign and seized control of Cairo. His sudden death shortly afterward opened the path for his young nephew Saladin. At the time, Saladin was not widely seen as a dominant figure. Yet he possessed a rare blend of capabilities: diplomatic intelligence, administrative insight, military competence, the loyalty of Kurdish troops, and a deep sense of religious mission. Within months of assuming power, he began transforming Egypt from within. In 1171, Saladin abolished the Fatimid Caliphate altogether and restored Egypt's allegiance to the Sunni Abbasid order. This was a seismic shift. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, Egypt and Syria were aligned under the same religious and political authority. No development since the fall of Edessa had posed a greater danger to the Latin states. Their southern flank, once protected by Fatimid weakness, was now controlled by a dynamic, organized leader committed to the Sunni revival long championed by Nur ad-Din. The Knights monitored these changes with growing alarm. Their scouts tracked increased military traffic between Damascus and Cairo. Trade along Red Sea routes shifted under new taxation policies. Frontier fortresses such as Gaza and those in southern Judea reported heightened activity. Refugees fleeing coastal Egypt described new military reforms, reorganized recruitment systems, and stricter governance. Templar commanders from Saf to Gaza warned Jerusalem that Egypt was no longer a vulnerable prize, but the foundation of a rising empire. Yet the Latin states, drained financially, divided politically, and small in population, could not adapt quickly enough. At the same time, Jerusalem faced its own spiral of crisis. King Amalric, having spent years attempting to seize Egypt, now realized he had inadvertently created a far more dangerous adversary. His final years were marked by desperate attempts to secure alliances with Byzantium, diplomatic missions to Europe, and negotiations with the Knights on how to reinforce the kingdom's southern defenses. By the early 1170s, Jerusalem's treasury was nearly depleted, its population weary, and many major fortresses in urgent need of repair. The threat grew continuously. When Amalric died in 1174, the crown passed to his young son, Baldwin IV, who would soon become known as the Leper King. His illness and minority worsened political divisions among the nobility at the exact moment unity was most essential. The Knights could see the danger clearly, but they lacked the authority to impose strategic discipline. Meanwhile, the balance of power shifted further. Initially, Saladin had been Nur ad-Din's subordinate. Egypt was expected to support a united Muslim front under the Zengid ruler's leadership. But once entrenched in Cairo, Saladin began consolidating power independently. He replaced local officials with loyal Ayyubid commanders, reorganized Egypt's taxation system to build a stable revenue base, and created a new army loyal to him personally rather than to Syria. He initiated public works projects that strengthened his legitimacy among the Egyptian population. Nur ad-Din, recognizing the danger, began preparing an invasion of Egypt to reclaim control. But his death in 1174 removed the last meaningful obstacle between Saladin and total dominance. From 1174 to 1176, Saladin moved rapidly to unite Syria and Egypt. He marched into Damascus and secured the city with minimal resistance. He negotiated with Aleppo, reducing opposition through a mix of diplomacy and sustained pressure. He positioned himself as both political and symbolic leader of a broader Sunni revival, unifying religious sentiment with military ambition. This new empire possessed unrivaled advantages: Egypt's vast wealth, Syria's strategic geography, a unified command structure, a growing religious ideology supporting jihad, and highly skilled Kurdish and Turkic officers trained under Nur ad-Din. For the Crusader states, the consequences were catastrophic. They could no longer rely on fragmented Muslim rivals, competing dynasties, or isolated truces. A single ruler now commanded the region from Cairo to Damascus. The Knights recognized the gravity of this transformation earlier than most secular rulers. Their internal reports reflected deep concern. Raids on frontier regions were increasing, enemy troops were gathering in larger concentrations, assaults were becoming more coordinated, new siege equipment was appearing even in smaller raids, and Saladin's influence was rising among Muslim populations near frontier zones. They knew a major war was coming. The question was no longer if, but when. From 1174 onward, the region drifted steadily toward open conflict. Raids grew more intense in Galilee and along the Jordan Valley. Saladin tested Jerusalem's borders with targeted incursions. The Knights reinforced key fortresses such as Gaza, Toron, La Fève, and Chastel Rouge. Antioch suffered raids coordinated from both Aleppo and Hama. Peasants fled exposed frontier areas, weakening the tax base and reducing the manpower needed to support local garrisons. The order attempted to stabilize the situation, but the structural imbalance was now too profound. A unified Egypt-Syria under Saladin possessed more soldiers, more revenue, deeper strategic depth, greater political unity, and stronger ideological momentum than any Muslim power the Crusader states had faced in a century. Meanwhile, the Latin states were left with fewer resources, chronic internal rivalries, a sick young king, and unreliable Western support. The equilibrium that had protected them for decades had vanished. By the end of this period, one truth was undeniable. The Latin East was now facing the most powerful enemy it had ever encountered. Saladin had transformed Egypt, restructured Syria, and laid the foundation for a campaign designed to crush the Crusader states permanently. The Knights sensed what was coming. Their scouts reported substantial troop movements near Hama, Homs, Basra, and the approaches to Damascus. Communications between Templar commanderies revealed a growing conviction that only a single decisive conflict would determine the fate of the region. And that conflict was approaching faster than anyone expected. Section 9, 1174 to 1180. The Templars in crisis, the Leper King, internal strains, and Saladin's rise. The year 1174 marked far more than a royal transition. It signaled the arrival of a gathering storm for the Knights Templar. King Amalric I was dead, and the kingdom of Jerusalem stood on the edge of collapse. The failed Egyptian campaigns had drained the treasury, the army was weakened by severe losses, and the population was declining. Entire regions lacked stable baronial leadership. And now, at the center of this unstable world, stood a new monarch, Baldwin IV, the young king who had already begun to show the unmistakable signs of leprosy. In this fragile landscape, the Templars emerged as the kingdom's strongest, most disciplined, and most permanent military institution. Between internal political fractures and rising external threats, the order entered one of the most dangerous chapters in its history. Baldwin IV, intelligent but physically weakened by advancing illness, could not provide the sustained leadership the kingdom needed. His condition created recurring power vacuums within the court, and these gaps often had to be filled by the Templars themselves. The order now shouldered enormous responsibilities, defending the frontiers, manning permanent garrisons across the Jerusalem-Acre-Galilee corridor, serving as the king's personal military escort, representing the kingdom in diplomatic missions, and acting as a stabilizing force amid increasingly bitter rivalries within the nobility. Because Baldwin could not lead prolonged campaigns, the Grand Master and senior commanders of the order began influencing military planning more directly than ever before. For the first time in the Crusader kingdom's history, the military orders, not the lay barons, became the backbone of strategic decision-making. But the Templars were not only confronting dangers beyond the walls, they were trapped inside a political battlefield in Jerusalem itself. Three competing factions dominated the kingdom. Baldwin IV's inner circle, the court party supporting Guy de Lusignan, and the noble opposition led by Raymond III of Tripoli. All three sought the order's strength, yet none could fully control it. The Templars themselves were determined not to become the weapon of any faction. This forced them into constant political navigation, always calculating how their decisions might be interpreted. Every action risked alienating one power bloc or another. This political tension strained the order's coherence and directly affected its strategic readiness at a time when unity was essential. Meanwhile, beyond Jerusalem's borders, Saladin was transforming the entire political map of the Near East. During these years, he evolved from the ruler of Egypt into the de facto unifier of the Muslim world. Templar intelligence reports, carefully recorded in contemporary chronicles, warned repeatedly that new armies were being assembled in Aleppo and Damascus, that Kurdish and Turkish Gulam regiments were being merged, and that taxation and administration across Syria were being standardized. The roads between Egypt and Syria were secured, fortifications strengthened, and emirates that had once resisted now pledged their loyalty to Saladin. Templar commanders sent increasingly urgent messages to Jerusalem. Egypt and Syria were no longer political rivals. They were becoming a single empire, forming directly on the Crusader frontier. But Jerusalem's political factions, embroiled in their own rivalries, ignored these warnings. Between 1174 and 1180, Saladin repeatedly tested the frontier held by the Crusader states, and it was the Knights Templar who stood alone against these incursions. Their garrisons defended the major fortresses Safed, Gaza, Toron, La Fève, Chastelet, Bagrès, and Chastel Rouge, often without any support from feudal lords. The attacks striking these positions were relentless: large reconnaissance raids, the burning of villages, destruction of farmland, harassment of patrols, disruption of trade routes, and small probing sieges intended to test the resilience of border castles. With Latin barons divided, distracted, or simply absent, the entire burden of frontier defense fell on the order's shoulders. But the Templars also faced mounting internal strains. As the kingdom weakened, royal support for the order declined, leaving the Templars increasingly dependent on financial aid from their European commanderies. Personnel losses grew steady and severe as constant patrols and border skirmishes inflicted casualties on knights and sergeants alike. Within the order itself, strategic disagreements formed. Some commanders urged caution and advocated for a defensive posture, while others argued for a bold, preemptive strike against Saladin before his power became overwhelming. Meanwhile, tensions with Jerusalem's nobility deepened. Secular lords accused the Templars of being too wealthy, too independent, and too politically influential. These pressures weighed on the order as heavily as the battles they fought. And then there was Reynold of Châtillon. By the late 1170s, this unpredictable and often reckless ally posed a danger almost as great as the external enemy. Reynold repeatedly violated truces, attacking caravans, launching unauthorized raids, harassing diplomats, and disrupting fragile negotiations. The Templars openly condemned his actions, recognizing a simple truth: Reynold's provocations could give Saladin the perfect justification for launching a full-scale war. This combustible situation laid the final foundations for the catastrophic events that would soon define the coming decade. By 1180, the world that had defined the early Crusader period was gone. The era of fragmented Muslim emirates and limited frontier raids had ended. In its place stood a unified Egyptian-Syrian empire under Saladin, a kingdom of Jerusalem fractured by internal disputes, and a frontier defended almost entirely by the Templar order. This combination, the rising unity of the Muslim world, the political collapse of the Crusader kingdom, and the unsustainable strain placed on the knights, created the conditions that would lead to the tragedy of Hattin, the fall of Jerusalem, and the greatest losses the order would ever suffer. The years 1174 to 1180 were the calm before the fire, the quiet prelude to the Templars' darkest hour. Section 10, 1180 to 1187. The Templars facing the storm. Diplomacy collapses, raid warfare, and the road to Hattin. By the year 1180, The kingdom of Jerusalem stood on a trembling foundation. The Templars, isolated yet indispensable, found themselves pulled into a growing internal conflict that threatened to tear the Latin East apart from within, rather than from any enemy outside its borders. Two rival political factions now controlled the kingdom's destiny. On one side stood the court party, dominated by Queen Sibylla and her controversial husband, Guy of Lusignan. On the other side stood the noble opposition, led by Raymond III of Tripoli, the most experienced statesman in the kingdom. Officially, the Templars attempted to remain neutral, but neutrality had become impossible. Both factions demanded their support, both distrusted the order's independence, and both feared the influence it could exert. What the Templars wanted was simple: a unified kingdom capable of resisting Saladin. What they faced instead was a kingdom determined to destroy itself. While Jerusalem became mired in internal conflict, the Templars continued to report the same grim reality. Saladin was completing the unification of the Muslim world. Between 1180 and 1183, he brought Egypt, Damascus, Aleppo, and Mosul under his authority through conquest, alliance, or treaty. Homs and Hama soon followed through vassalage. For the first time since the First Crusade, the Muslim world stood under a single disciplined command. Templar intelligence writers carried increasingly dire reports to Jerusalem. New fortifications were rising along the Orontes. Supply lines stretching from Cairo to Damascus were secured. Cavalry divisions drilled tirelessly. Mamluk elite units were reorganized. Governors throughout Syria were replaced with Saladin's loyalists, and roads across the empire were cleared for rapid troop movements. The meaning was unmistakable. The Latin kingdom was no longer surrounded by fragmented emirates, but by a unified empire with a single purpose: to destroy the Crusader states. From 1180 onward, Saladin began a calculated strategy of relentless pressure. It was not yet open war. It was a campaign of systematic attrition. Every border fortress held by the Templars came under attack. La Fève, Saft, Toron, Gaza, the Jordan Valley posts, and the Galilee watchtowers endured wave after wave of raids. The order's knights and sergeants rode constant patrols, intercepting raiding bands, rescuing fleeing villagers, recovering bodies from burned olive fields, repairing shattered walls, and replacing fallen brothers with barely trained new recruits. This was a war designed not to conquer land, but to bleed the order. The barons of the kingdom were largely absent, entangled in political rivalry. The king, Baldwin IV, nearly blind and increasingly frail, depended almost entirely on regents. The Templars were left to hold the frontier alone. As one chronicler wrote, "If the temple banners did not fly, no border of Jerusalem would stand for a single season." In 1180, the court party, desperate for stability, pressed for a truce with Saladin. The Templars opposed it fiercely. They understood Saladin's strategy well. Peace was used only to rebuild strength, and when the moment was right, the attack would be ruthless. When the truce was signed, the Templars refused to observe it internally. They continued to prepare for war, reinforcing fortifications and strengthening border patrols. This created a dangerous split. The kingdom feared the Templars would provoke war. The Templars feared the kingdom was drifting blindly toward disaster. Both fears were justified, but only the Templars grasped the scale of what Saladin was preparing. Then came the spark that lit the fuse. Raynald of Châtillon, unpredictable and reckless, attacked a Muslim caravan that was traveling under Templar escort. The consequences were catastrophic. The caravan included high-ranking officials. Saladin took the attack as a personal insult. Though the Templars condemned Raynald immediately, they were blamed for failing to prevent the incident. Saladin declared the truce broken. War became inevitable. Raynald had handed Saladin the perfect justification for a full-scale offensive, and the divided kingdom was powerless to prevent what followed. In 1185, the kingdom suffered the loss it could least afford. Baldwin IV, the Leper King, the only figure capable of balancing rival political factions, finally succumbed to his illness. His death left a child king, Baldwin V, a fractured regency, and a kingdom effectively leaderless. Templar reports from this period revealed deep alarm. There was no unity in the high court, barons refused cooperation, troops went unpaid, castles lacked supplies, and enemy armies were gathering in Damascus and Cairo. The storm was approaching, and the kingdom had no captain. When Baldwin V died soon after, the high court descended into chaos. Sibylla maneuvered her husband Guy of Lusignan onto the throne. To the Templars, Guy represented everything they feared: inexperience, impulsiveness, unpopularity among the barons, and a complete lack of military credibility. Yet, the Templar Grand Master, Gerard de Riedfort, supported Guy, a political decision that fractured the order from within. Even other Templars doubted Riedfort's judgment. The kingdom was now hopelessly divided. Northern barons aligned with Raymond of Tripoli, southern lords with Guy, and the Templars caught between them, dragged into a conflict they could neither control nor escape. Meanwhile, Saladin completed his preparations. Between 1186 and 1187, he moved his forces into 3 strategic positions. A main field army gathered in Damascus, flanking cavalry concentrated in the Golan Heights, and reinforcements and siege engines advancing from Cairo. Templar scouts brought increasingly dire warnings to Jerusalem, enemy numbers greater than ever before, camps stretching beyond the horizon, supplies arriving from every emirate, and a newly formed elite guard of Mamluks preparing for war. The reports were clear. Saladin was preparing for a war of annihilation, and the kingdom was far from ready. Shortly before the main conflict erupted, disaster struck at Cresson. Gerard de Riedfort led a small Templar detachment into battle against what they believed was a reconnaissance unit. Instead, they encountered a far larger and more skilled Muslim force. Almost every knight in the Templar Hospitaller contingent was killed. Only a few escaped. The frontier was now open. The Templars' best commanders were dead, and Saladin knew that the moment for his final offensive had arrived. By mid-1187, the storm could no longer be delayed. Templar strength was depleted, castle garrisons understaffed, supply lines strained, and political unity shattered. Guy's leadership was doubted. Raymond's faction was alienated. Reynold's provocations had destroyed diplomacy. And Saladin's armies were mobilized in full. For the first time in their history, the Templars faced a war they knew they could not win alone. The next chapter, the disaster at Hattin, the fall of Jerusalem, and the near destruction of the order, was no longer avoidable. The storm had arrived. Section 11, 1187. The Battle of Hattin, the day the Templars broke. Dawn rose over the scorched hills of Galilee in July 1187, but the story of Hattin had begun long before the first rays of light touched the battlefield. The Knights Templar, preparing for the greatest trial in their 70 years of existence, marched into a disaster shaped not by the enemy before them, but by months of political betrayal, bitter rivalries, and catastrophic decisions made in the courts of Jerusalem. The Templars understood the danger far earlier than the king or his nobles. Their scouts had reported Saladin's armies gathering in Damascus, caravans of supplies moving up from Egypt, siege engines rolling across the desert, and every emirate in Syria pledging loyalty to him. Tens of thousands of soldiers were mobilizing into a single unified force. Yet warnings brought to King Guy were met with hesitation. Inexperience, uncertainty, and political pressure paralyzed him. The Templars had faced war many times, but never with a kingdom so unprepared, so divided, and so blind. The final spark came from Reynold of Châtillon, whose reckless cruelty had already dragged the realm to the brink more than once. Ignoring the truce, Reynold attacked a Muslim caravan, capturing nobles, merchants, and even members of Saladin's own household. Humiliated, Saladin swore he would kill Reynold with his own hand, but he also made a far graver vow: the peace was finished and the kingdom would fall. The Templars had not begun this war, yet they were about to be thrust into its center. In early July, Saladin marched into Galilee and laid siege to Tiberias. Guy summoned the barons and the military orders to assemble at Sephoria, the last position offering water, shade, and defensible ground. The Templars arrived with perhaps 150 to 200 knights, 300 to 400 sergeants, and the banner of the order carried proudly by the marshal. Grand Master Gérard de Riedefort was in command. Their numbers were small, but they represented the elite core of any crusader line. At Sephoria, the leaders faced a choice that would decide the fate of the kingdom. They could remain in safety and force Saladin to abandon the siege, or march across the burning plateau to relieve Tiberias and meet him deep within his own territory. Raymond of Tripoli, the most seasoned general in the kingdom, pleaded with Guy not to move. "Marching into the desert in July is madness," he warned. "Saladin wants us away from the water." But Riedefort, driven by pride and hatred of Raymond, insisted that abandoning a Christian city would be shameful. "Let us march," he declared. "God will be with us." Guy, wavering between voices, chose the Grand Master. It was the most disastrous decision of his reign, and the choice that would shatter the Templar order. On July 3rd, the Crusader host left Sephoria. The heat rose above 40 degrees Celsius. The plateau offered no shade and no water. Saladin's cavalry shadowed the column, lighting fields on fire to choke the air with smoke. At the head of the army marched the Templars, encased in heavy armor that burned in the sun. As the day stretched on, horses collapsed, muscles stiffened, and entire formations began to disintegrate. Saladin, watching from the ridges, saw his plan unfolding exactly as intended. By nightfall, the Crusader army was trapped near the twin peaks of the Horns of Hattin. Exhausted, gasping for water, and surrounded on all sides, they made camp on the dry plain. Then Saladin gave the order: "Set the fields on fire." Flames swept across the slope, wind carrying smoke directly into the Crusader camp. All night, warriors coughed, choked, and clawed at the dry earth in desperation. Horses panicked, men collapsed, and from the dark ridges overhead came the beating of drums and the chanting of prayers, ensuring no one slept. The Templars understood the truth. The battle ahead would not be fought for victory, but simply to survive. At dawn on July the 4th, the Crusader army attempted one final push toward the Sea of Galilee. Water was their only hope, but Saladin's troops blocked their advance before they reached the lake. The battle erupted in stages: a desperate Templar charge, a ring of archers closing in, infantry collapsing under heat and smoke, and the final blow, the capture of the True Cross, symbol of divine favor. Surrounded, the Templars formed a tight defensive circle around their banner and held longer than any other formation on the field. Arrows, cavalry, fire, and choking smoke broke against their shield wall. But the sun killed more of their horses than the enemy did. By midday, even the Templar discipline could not hold. Dehydrated, exhausted, and outnumbered 10 to 1, the last survivors were forced to surrender. King Guy, along with several nobles, was taken alive. But Saladin reserved no mercy for the warrior monks. He ordered all captured Templar and Hospitaller knights brought before him. Because Saladin believed these men would never stop fighting him, he commanded that they be executed. One by one, between 200 and 300 knights were beheaded in his presence, many by religious volunteers, as ordinary soldiers refused to carry out the task. Gérard de Riedefort alone was spared to be used for political leverage. In a single afternoon, virtually the entire active field force of the Templar Order was annihilated. It was the greatest military disaster in their history. The collapse did not end on the battlefield. In the months that followed, the Crusader world imploded. Acre fell, Nablus fell. Jaffa, Tehran, Sidon, Beirut, Ascalon, Gaza all crumbled in rapid succession. And at last, Jerusalem itself surrendered. The Templar castles were undermanned, their commanders dead, their ranks shattered beyond repair. The Order's greatest northern fortress, Tortosa, offered no real resistance. Gaza was abandoned. The heart of the Templar mission, the Holy City, was lost. Everything they had built since 1119 collapsed in less than 90 days. After Hattin, the Order existed only in name. Their field army was gone, their reserves were gone, their fortresses stood empty or captured, their political influence evaporated. The Knights Templar, once the most feared warriors in the Latin East, were reduced to fragments of garrisons and a handful of survivors who escaped the slaughter. The era of the Order's greatest strength ended forever on the slopes of Hattin. What came next would be a desperate struggle to rebuild what had been lost. Section 12, 1187 to 1240. Rebirth in Acre. The Templars reorganize, rebuild, and return to power. 1. Ashes of the kingdom and a scattered order. After Hattin and the fall of Jerusalem, the Knights Templar stood on the very edge of extinction. Their field army had been destroyed, their commanders were dead or in captivity, and many of their fortresses lay empty, undermanned, or surrendered. Yet the Order itself did not die. Those who survived the catastrophe retreated north toward the coast, clinging to whatever strongholds were still defensible. The new map of their world looked stark. Acre remained the last major defensible city. Tyre was held stubbornly by Conrad of Montferrat. Tripoli and Antioch were isolated but still intact. Cyprus loomed as a potential refuge. And in Europe, news of the disaster shocked rulers and nobles into readiness for renewed crusading efforts. From these scattered fragments, coastal cities, surviving fortresses, and distant allies, the Templars began to rebuild. Their survival in the years after 1187 stands as one of the most remarkable reorganizations in medieval military history. 2. The fall of Jerusalem and the shift to Acre. When Jerusalem formally surrendered to Saladin in October 1187, one group was more reluctant than any other to abandon the Holy City, the Templars themselves. Their temple compound had been their birthplace, their symbol, and the physical heart of their mission. They were not allowed to keep it. Saladin made no exceptions. The sacred charge that had defined the Order since 1119 was lost. Forced to choose a new center, the Templars turned to Acre. Acre was a wealthy Mediterranean port, strongly defensible, connected directly to Europe by sea, and strategically placed for both trade and military operations. It quickly filled with refugees, soldiers, and merchants fleeing the collapsed interior. From 1187 onward, Acre became the beating heart of the Templar Order. It was from this city that they would rebuild their military strength, their political influence, and their place in the Crusader world. 3. Europe responds, the Third Crusade. The loss of Jerusalem electrified Europe. Monarchs who had ignored the Eastern Front for decades suddenly moved to action. Richard I of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany all took the cross. Among them, the Templars quickly recognized that Richard would become their most crucial ally. He admired professional soldiery, trusted disciplined orders more than feuding barons, valued intelligence, naval power, and logistics, and shared the Templars' disdain for incompetent nobles. When Richard arrived in the East in 1191, he found the Templars already deep into the work of reconstruction, recruiting new brothers from Europe, bringing fresh horses and equipment, strengthening the defenses of Acre, offering expertise in naval operations, rebuilding banking and supply networks, and acting as intermediaries in delicate diplomacy. Richard immediately understood how indispensable they had become. Throughout the crusade, the Templars served as his shock cavalry, his frontline scouts, his negotiators, and often his financial administrators. 4. The Siege of Acre, 1189 to 1191, A new generation of Templars. The 2-year siege of Acre was one of the longest and bloodiest operations in medieval warfare. Veterans of Hatton now fought shoulder to shoulder with new recruits from Europe. Templars manned siege towers, repelled counterattacks, built stone-throwing engines, led night assaults, negotiated directly with Richard, and maintained discipline within the chaotic Crusader camp. Their order and professionalism contrasted sharply with the rivalries and unrest among nobles and mercenaries. Many of the young knights who would later command the order earned their reputations during this brutal campaign. When Acre finally fell in 1191, it marked the first major victory since Hatton, and for the Templars, it symbolized something more: rebirth. 5. The new headquarters, the Great Templar Complex in Acre. With Jerusalem lost, the Templars poured their resources into transforming Acre into their new stronghold. They constructed a massive fortified complex, high stone walls, a deep moat, a towered gatehouse, barracks and stables, training yards, a central commandery hall, a chapel, underground storage spaces, and direct access to the harbor for their ships. This headquarters became the largest Templar institution after Jerusalem and took over its role as the order's financial center, military nerve station, diplomatic court, and administrative headquarters. From this fortress, which would stand until 1291, the Templars projected their influence across the Mediterranean. 6. The Templars under Richard the Lionheart, 1191 to 1192. Templar forces fought alongside Richard in all the major engagements of the campaign: Arsuf, Jaffa, the coastal road advances, skirmishes along the Sharon Plain, and the defense of Jaffa itself. Richard consulted them on virtually every major strategic decision. They tended to urge caution, discipline, and incremental gains, while Richard himself sometimes favored daring, high-risk maneuvers. Despite these differences, the alliance in battle was formidable. At Arsuf, Templar cavalry played a key role in the countercharge that broke Saladin's flank, helping to secure one of the Crusade's most famous victories. Throughout these campaigns, the Templars acted as Richard's shock troops, his mounted vanguard, and at times his personal guard. When the crusade ended without retaking Jerusalem, the Templars remained behind as guardians of the remaining coastal cities. Their mission had changed. They were no longer striving to liberate the Holy City, but to defend what was left. 7. Castle warfare, Safed, Tortosa, and Château Pèlerin. Between 1192 and 1240, the Templars turned increasingly to fortress warfare, becoming the designers, builders, and defenders of some of the strongest castles in the medieval world. Safed, rebuilt on a grand scale, dominated Galilee and guarded the routes toward Damascus. Tortosa, heavily reinforced, served as one of the strongest northern citadels, absorbing pressure from enemies of Antioch. Their masterpiece, Château Pèlerin, rose on the coast south of Acre, a colossal maritime fortress protected by an almost impregnable seawall. These fortresses allowed the Templars to control trade routes, enforce truces, secure regional borders, shelter pilgrims and refugees, store crucial supplies, and withstand Mamluk attacks long after other Christian powers had fallen back. 8. Diplomacy and financial power, a state within a state. Freed from the responsibility of directly governing a vast kingdom, the Templars shifted into an even more complex role. They became the international bankers and diplomats of the Crusader world. Kings borrowed money from them. Merchants relied on their letters of credit and safe transport for treasure. The order provided intelligence on Muslim politics, mediated disputes between rival barons, financed armies, and offered naval transport between Cyprus, Acre, and European ports. Their web of preceptories across Europe became the financial backbone sustaining the Crusader states. By the early 13th century, the Templars had regained much of their pre-Hatton power, this time not only through battlefield strength, but through mastery of politics, logistics, and finance. They were no longer just warriors. They had become a transnational institution, wealthy, feared, respected, and nearly indispensable. 9. The new political landscape and the shadow of the Mamluks. As the 13th century advanced, a new and more brutal threat emerged from within Egypt, the Mamluks. These were slave soldiers trained from childhood, ruthlessly efficient and intensely disciplined. While Saladin had unified the Muslim world, many of his successors proved weaker rulers. The Mamluks, however, were the opposite. Templar intelligence reports from this period warned of sweeping military reforms in Egypt, the concentration of power in Cairo, the formation of new elite cavalry regiments, growing aggression on the frontiers, and a succession of palace coups that eventually placed the Mamluks in full control of the country. The order understood that a new age of war was coming, one likely to be harsher and more relentless than anything they had yet faced. 10. The order at its zenith, a reborn power. By around 1240, the Templars stood once again near the height of their power. Their fortresses were strong, their numbers had recovered, their treasuries were rich, their influence over kings was immense, their commandery in Acre outshone all other institutions in the Latin East. Their naval routes tied Europe to the Levant in a continuous line of ships and harbors. Their standing forces were professional, well-armed, and experienced. From near destruction in 1187, the order had risen to near dominance by 1240. Yet this renewed golden age would not last. On the horizon loomed the rise of Baibars, the collapse of the remaining Crusader states, the fall of Acre, the retreat to Cyprus, and finally the political betrayals in France that would erase the order entirely. For the moment, however, the Knights Templar stood reborn, risen from ashes, stronger than ever, heading into the final and most deadly century of their existence. Section 13, 1240 to 1291. The last century of power, Mamluk rise, the fall of the castles, and the siege of Acre. By 1240, the Knights Templar were once again powerful. Their fortresses were rebuilt, their numbers restored, and their finances strong. Yet the world into which they had risen was far more volatile than the one they had lost in 1187. Three great forces were reshaping the Middle East, and all of them would press against the order in its final century. The first was the rise of the Mamluks, military elites within Egypt who would soon overthrow their own sultans and forge the strongest army the Crusaders had ever faced. The second was the arrival of the Mongols, whose devastating invasions swept westward, smashing long-standing Muslim political structures and plunging the region into chaos that many Crusaders hoped to exploit. The third force was closer to home, a fragmented Latin world filled with competing kings, rival barons, and crusades that were increasingly driven by politics rather than faith. For the Templars, this combination meant decades of shifting alliances, complicated diplomacy, and an ever more desperate form of castle warfare. Within the order itself, unity was breaking down. In the 13th century, the Templar leadership split over how to respond to the changing environment. One camp, often called the hardline Knights, demanded constant offensive action. They rejected negotiations with Muslim rulers and looked eagerly to potential alliances with the Mongols, hoping to use the eastern invaders against their traditional foes. Opposing them stood the pragmatic commanders, who favored truces to preserve what remained of the Crusader cities. They argued for strengthening fortresses rather than seeking open battle and pushed for diplomacy with the courts of Cairo and Damascus. This internal division shaped nearly every major decision in the last 50 years of the Crusader states. Much of the conflict played out in Acre, where Templar grandmasters debated bitterly with Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, and increasingly independent secular barons over how to survive in a world that was turning against them. While the Templars argued, a revolution unfolded in Egypt. The Mamluks, slave soldiers of Turkish and Circassian origin, raised from childhood for war, overthrew their Ayyubid masters and seized the state. Under them, Egypt produced better cavalry, stronger discipline, faster mobilization, relentless military reform, and a near cult-like warrior ethos. Their leaders, Aybek, Qutuz, and above all Baybars, were brilliant commanders who enjoyed absolute loyalty from their troops. The Templars quickly understood the difference. The Ayyubids had been dangerous, the Mamluks would be catastrophic. At the same time, another storm approached from the east. The Mongols advanced across the Middle East, and when Baghdad fell in 1258, entire regions collapsed into ruin. Many Crusader barons believed this was the moment to strike back at Islam with Mongol support. The Templars, however, were deeply divided. Some favored an alliance with the Mongols against the Mamluks, seeing them as useful hammers against a common enemy. Others feared Mongol brutality and unpredictability and argued that no trust could be placed in them. Most leaders tried to remain neutral, and a few attempted the dangerous game of playing both sides. This tangled diplomacy would have lasting consequences for the fate of the Crusader states. The first great blow in this final era fell upon Saft, one of the greatest Templar fortresses ever built. Its massive walls, advanced towers, deep cisterns, and commanding view over Galilee had made it a symbol of the order's engineering genius. In 1266, Baybars himself led the siege. He brought trebuchets to smash the walls, undermined the foundations, deployed elite assault troops to storm the breaches, cut supply routes, waged psychological warfare, and offered surrender terms he later broke. After weeks of desperate resistance, Saft fell. Baybars gave a chilling order. Every Templar inside was to be executed. The loss was devastating. One of their strongest castles destroyed, hundreds of knights killed, the order's prestige shattered, and morale deeply damaged. It marked the beginning of a series of disasters that the Templars, no matter how bravely they fought, could no longer prevent. 2 years later, in 1268, Baybars struck again, this time at Antioch, the oldest and once most powerful of the Crusader principalities. Templars stationed in the region were swept aside by a massive assault. Outer defenses fell quickly, city walls were breached, thousands were killed, and civilians were deported into captivity. The principality itself ceased to exist. The fall of Antioch shocked Europe and signaled that the end of the Crusader states had truly begun. The remaining Templars withdrew to Acre, now the last great stronghold of Christian power in the east. By the 1270s, Acre was a city under siege even in peace. It was overcrowded with refugees, divided by faction, rife with corruption, politically fractured and economically unstable, its streets filled with mercenaries and desperate migrants. Within this chaos, the Templars tried to impose some order. They enforced discipline, patrolled the docks, provided naval protection, acted as bankers, negotiated truces, and more than once suppressed riots and street violence. Yet conflicts with the Hospitallers and with rival Genoese and Venetian factions weakened the city from within. The Templars were powerful, but even they were not strong enough to impose unity on a collapsing state. Meanwhile, their outlying strongholds fell one after another. Bagras was lost after repeated Mamluk assaults. Tehran surrendered once it became hopelessly isolated from Acre. Beaufort fell after a long and punishing siege. Chastel Blanc was abandoned under pressure. Finally, the great sea fortress of Chateau Pellerin, once considered nearly impregnable, was evacuated when even its formidable defenses could not resist encirclement. By then, only Acre remained. The Templar world had shrunk to a single vulnerable city on a narrow strip of coastline. In the 1280s, under Sultan Qalawun, the Mamluks continued their relentless advance. Margat fell. Latakia was taken. In 1289, Tripoli was destroyed. The few remaining towns either surrendered or were razed. The Templars fought with extraordinary bravery, but they could not wage war on so many fronts with so few men and resources. Their leaders sent desperate messages to Europe. If aid did not come, The kingdom would perish. Europe did not respond. The final act came in 1291. In April, Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil marched on Acre at the head of a massive army, perhaps the largest the Mamluks ever fielded. The Templars manned the western walls, the towers along the sea, the huge Templar quarter, and the inner defensive lines. The siege lasted 6 brutal weeks. Mamluk forces employed siege towers, great battering engines, mangonels, incendiary projectiles, sappers tunneling beneath walls, assault ladders, night attacks, and continuous bombardment. The Templars fought with a determination that even Muslim chroniclers recorded with respect, praising their discipline and courage. But the walls could not hold forever. When they finally collapsed, the last day turned into a nightmare of close-quarters combat. Narrow streets filled with fighting as Templars covered the evacuation of civilians toward the ships. Courtyards became killing grounds where knights made their final stands. One commander after another fell, yet the order's banner remained raised until the very last moment. Only a handful of knights escaped by sea when the Templar fortress at last went down in ruin. Acre burned. The Crusader states were finished. The Templars' 170-year presence in the Holy Land had come to an end. The survivors fled to Cyprus. There, they faced a new reality. No territory of their own, no kingdom to defend, no strongholds, a shattered military force, isolation from European politics, mounting suspicion from monarchs, and a treasury that now seemed too large for an order without a homeland. The fall of Acre marked the end of the Templars as a functioning military organization. What followed would be worse. The order had survived the Mamluks, only to face a far more dangerous enemy: Christian kings. Section 14, 1291 to 1312. The end of the order: betrayal, arrests, torture, trials, and the death of Jacques de Molay. When Acre collapsed into fire and rubble in May of 1291, the last surviving Templars fled the burning city and escaped by ship to Cyprus. What washed up on those shores was not an army, but a remnant: exhausted knights, wounded sergeants, a few surviving commanders, administrators clutching their records and ledgers, and civilians rescued from the harbor as everything they knew crumbled behind them. Their world had vanished. There was no Holy Land, no frontier, no fortresses, no mission that resembled the one they were created to fulfill. The massive stone commandery in Acre, the symbol of their power, had become ruins. And without land to defend, the Templars became something both extraordinary and dangerous: a wealthy, independent, international institution with no battlefield to justify its existence. That uneasy reality would define the final 2 decades of their story. On Cyprus, the order attempted to rebuild. They fortified coastal towns, expanded agricultural estates, re-established a naval presence, rebuilt trade routes, reopened their banking operations, supported crusade proposals in Europe, and trained new recruits in the hope of someday returning to the mainland. But Cyprus was unstable. The Lusinian kings viewed the Templars with suspicion, jealousy, and fear. The order was too powerful to ignore and too independent to control. Meanwhile, on the mainland, the Mamluks were expanding relentlessly, making the dream of a new crusade increasingly unrealistic. And in Europe, a far greater danger was awakening. By the early 1300s, the most powerful threat to the Templar order was not Baibars, not the Mamluks, and not rival crusading orders, but the King of France himself. Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, was brilliant, ruthless, and deeply in debt. The Templars were everything he was not: wealthy, exempt from taxes, loyal only to the Pope, owners of vast lands inside France, controllers of noble and royal accounts, and keepers of sensitive financial archives. They had a private army. They were independent. And worst of all, he owed them enormous sums of money. To Philip, The Templars represented a financial crisis and a political rival. And so, he set his mind on destroying them. In 1292, the order elected Jacques de Molay as its 23rd Grand Master. De Molay was a seasoned knight, courageous, loyal, dedicated to the mission, disciplined, and politically naive. He was a perfect Templar, but a disastrously poor politician. For years he traveled across Europe, meeting kings, negotiating with popes, raising funds, preparing fleets, and trying desperately to rally support for a new crusade. But Europe was fractured, the papacy was unstable, and the age of crusading zeal was ending. De Molay did not realize that the greatest danger he would ever face stood not in Cairo or Damascus, but in Paris. By 1305, Philip's plan was ready. He would destroy the Templars in a single coordinated strike and seize their wealth for the crown. For this, he required a long list of fabricated accusations, a compliant pope, control over French courts, confessions extracted through torture, and an attack executed with absolute surprise. Royal agents collected rumors, invented stories, and forged accusations of heresy, idol worship, spitting on the cross, immoral rites, occult practices, and every variety of moral corruption imaginable. None of it existed in Templar records, in the rule of the order, or in eyewitness reports from the Holy Land. The charges were manufactured for maximum shock value. But Philip still needed a pope who would submit. He found one in Clement V, a weak pontiff pressured into French influence. The trap was now set. Before dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, a date that would echo through legend, Philip launched a massive nationwide operation. Across all of France, Templar commanderies were stormed, knights seized, brothers imprisoned, horses and weapons confiscated, treasuries emptied, and archives taken. Even Jacques de Molay himself was arrested while performing the solemn duty of carrying a royal funeral bier. Only hours later, the accusations were announced: heresy, blasphemy, corruption, idol worship, unnatural rites, and crimes against all of Christendom. Europe was stunned. The Pope protested. But Philip already had the order in chains. The torture that followed was among the most brutal of the medieval era. Templars were stretched on the rack, starved, deprived of sleep, burned, mutilated, threatened with execution, and psychologically broken. Under unbearable agony, many confessed to whatever their tortures demanded. The confessions were contradictory, often retracted, and obviously produced under duress, but Philip did not care. He now had the proof he needed. Clement V attempted to regain control, interviewing Templars personally, reopening investigations, halting torture, and even considering reforms instead of dissolution. But Philip pressed harder, threatening schism and violence. Eventually, the Pope broke. He summoned an official inquiry. Brave Templar representatives traveled to the papal court, recanting their torture-induced confessions and defending the innocence of the order with dignity. But it no longer mattered. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, the Church gave its verdict. The Knights Templar were dissolved. Their lands were transferred to the Hospitallers. Their leaders were condemned to imprisonment or death. Their treasury was seized. Their name erased from the military rolls of Christendom. The greatest order of the Crusades had ceased to exist. 2 years later came the final tragedy. In 1314, Jacques de Molay, after 7 long years in chains, was brought forth to publicly confess one last time. But the old knight refused. Before a stunned Parisian crowd, he retracted every confession he had ever made under torture. "I declare before heaven and earth," he said, "the order is innocent. These charges are false. We have committed no crime." Philip IV was furious. He ordered de Molay's immediate execution. That evening, Jacques de Molay and his companion, Geoffrey de Charnay, were led to a small island in the Seine and burned alive. Chroniclers wrote that de Molay faced the flames without fear, calling upon God to judge those who condemned the order. His death marked not only the end of the Knights Templar, but the end of the entire crusading era. And yet the order's legacy survived long after the ashes cooled. Their innovations in finance helped lay the foundations of modern banking. Their fortresses influenced medieval and early Renaissance military architecture. Their maritime networks shaped Mediterranean trade. Their legends of secrecy, betrayal, loyalty, and injustice grew far beyond their history. The Templars began as 9 humble knights protecting pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem. They ended as a global institution undone not by armies or enemies of the faith, but by Christian kings and corrupted courts. And their final Grand Master died with the same unwavering courage that had defined the order from its first day, unbroken in faith and unyielding in the face of death.